Howdy there, and welcome to Weekend's Web App. This is day 25 of the stream where we're building a front-end app, done right, done live. And when we finished off last time, we were essentially putting the finishing touches on our testing for our code. And I feel like we're at this position where either we build the app or we cover some sort of other sort of baseline concept before we get into that, and that's what I want to do with the next couple of streams. I want to build sort of the promotion part of this project, as it were, just something where we maybe embed in a YouTube playlist, talk about what it's all about. And what I want to use this as a jumping off point for learning about CSS, the language cascading style sheets, which is all about making your website look a particular way. And as I've said in the last stream, it's a kind of thing that trips a lot of people up, even highly accomplished programmers. Once you get into this realm of putting your design and encoding it into HTML and CSS, they sometimes struggle a bit. And there are a few reasons for this, partially because the language can be hard to work with, but it's also partially because they're maybe not applying all of their programming concepts when they use it. But either way, this is going to be serving as more of an introduction to CSS to make sure that we've got some base concepts understood as we go into the app proper. So before we leap into that, let's talk about what we're going to do, because I want to use concrete examples, build those concrete examples, and use that to help inform the concepts around CSS. So we've got this page here, and I'll bring the zoom up. So this is not an app about, this is not a stream about design, and I am not a designer, to be really clear. So I'm just doing something really Spartan. I've got some people helping me out with the branding for the actual app itself, which is a partial reason to sandbag so that we're not getting straight into it, because that stuff isn't ready yet. But yeah, just to be really clear, I'm not an artist. I'm not a designer by any stretch of the imagination. I can push a few pixels around here and there, but I am not good at what I do when it comes to that sort of thing. But I do know how to encode a design accurately into development, and I believe that despite a lot of people talking about times where they want to where they do designs in the browser and that kind of thing, I try to avoid that kind of mindset. I very much like to have something that I'm setting out to achieve, and I base it up after some sort of design that's done in a design application, such as Sketch, Photoshop, Illustrator. And what we're using here is Figma, and that's mainly because that way I don't have to jump back and forth between my preference, which is to do all my development on Linux, and where all the actual illustrative all the actual graphic design applications, they all exist on Mac or on Windows. So I'd have to be constantly jumping back and forth if I wanted to do that properly and do that design in front. So I'm just going to use Figma for this sort of thing. And Figma was nice. It's, I mean, essentially free if you keep it at low keep it at the low levels of the plans. So this will do us just fine, just for the little things that we need to do for now. Anyway, so I've got this basic design here, and we want to put this into CSS. And most of the time, the first thing, you don't even want to think about the CSS too much. Like, sometimes there'll be certain parts of sort of the design that might be kind of scary, or like you're not sure about, so you have to sort of nut things out in your head and really figure out how you're going to encode it. But most of the time, you're really thinking about structure first. So that's what we're going to do to start off today. Now, if you want to catch up the code to where we are from last time, as usual, you can get the code from from github.com/weareoffsider/weekendswebapp. And once you've got the repository, you can use git checkout a day 24 to start off where we are, because we are on day 25. So what we're going to do is, I'll get the server running as well. There we go, send that into the background. So we've got this index.pug. We've also got a test.pug. We're going to make a new one called client wwa home.pug, and that's going to serve as our sort of index page here. And I'm just going to grab some bits and pieces, chuck them in. And what else can we do? We can get rid of this. All right, so we're going to start ourselves off with a blank page. I'll comment this out as well. And we'll just make sure that we can see that to start off with. So I'm going to jump to localhost 80,000. Oh geez, I've forgotten my numbers. I'm a little tired. Bear with me. All right, so there's the old app. We can ignore that though, because we want to jump into tests. Sorry, no, www.home.html. Okay, so we've got this blank page here, and we can see here we've got the title and we've got the commented code here. So that's good. In addition to that, we want to add a style sheet. So this one, so we've got node modules mocker coming in as well, and what we want to do is also have say a wwa home.less. That's going to help us build out our CSS, and I'm going to restart the server, so let me just do that. Okay. So I'm just going to make sure that this works. I'll just set the body to black for now. All right, yep, up, reloaded, and we're all good. So you can see here, we've got in the head, we've got the CSS, we've got the title, and we are good to go. Right, so this was, I mean, based on the introduction, this is CSS, right? Great. Like, you can base you can tell certain things to look like certain things. So the selector chooses a part of your document, and then this this value or this key property, then attribute, this determines what a particular aspect of that thing looks like. And that's a very simplistic explanation, because I don't want to get too far into it just yet, because if we want to build out this thing that we've just talked about, we need something to hang it off of. So it's very important, especially when you're getting started, to just forget about what it looks like to start off with and think about more what's in it, because that's far more essential to you ending up with something that works. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to ignore everything else, and we're just going to get the content in. That's it. Okay, so here we've got some sort of header, right? And there is a tag in HTML called header, so we can use that just fine. And inside it is going to be a H1, which is the top level of the HTML. Now inside it, we've got this Weekends Web App, and we've got this tagline. So potentially we could actually separate these. We could do something like Weekends Web App, and we could do a H2 front end. It's not necessary. Maybe that's semantically not right because it's a tagline, but let's just keep on going for now. This isn't necessarily instruction about HTML semantics. And we've also got this little logo here. This little logo. Now, luckily, just like a lot of good vector art programs, you can actually copy that out as SVG. So I might be able to give myself this exact document right here, this SVG. Just put a dot on the inside of that, and I believe that will actually give me my SVG. Let's just check that. Well, it's not showing for us, and that's because we're not getting ourselves necessarily an optimized thing. So I might actually put this through SVGO. So SVGs are interesting because sometimes, especially programs like this, don't necessarily optimize them for you. But what you can do is go to a thing called SVG, oh my god, and it's a SVG optimizer that lets you do certain things, like you can copy this SVG, and in fact I'll just change the colors to black just to get it out of the way. No, I don't need to do that. It'll be fine. All right, so I'm going to copy that SVG, And then I'm going to send it over to SVG. Oh my god. Paste it in. And it's going to be kind of hard to see. Yeah, because it's white on this text here. It's absolutely going to be hard to see. I can't actually see it myself. Oh no, I can. There we go. All right. I was mouse wheeling the wrong way. Anyway, so with the optimization of the SVG, now what looked like this is now more like this. So there's a whole lot less to it, and that makes it a lot easier for me to edit it down and make it something that I can manually edit in SVG, which I kind of like to do personally. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap that in just a span for now. And I'm just going to pull it to pieces, or indent it so it's a bit easier to read what's going on. Doesn't feel particularly efficient. Like, it feels like it could have been chopped down a little bit more. But anyway, I'm not going to get too distracted with that because it's fine. And the only thing I'm going to do though is I'm going to change the stroke from white to current color. And that's a nice thing in SVGs, like, because you can really control the color even with CSS and stuff like that. It gives you a lot more room to do interesting things with all these lines. Now, I'm pretty sure I can get away with getting rid of this entirely, so let me just see how that goes. Alright, so you can now see that we've got our little thing here, and it should be of a pretty decent detail. There we go. As I said, not the greatest logo, it's just a thing I made up based off my business, my partner made. It looks like that. Great. Okay, so I just took those and just smashed a bunch on top of each other to kind of make it look like WWA. Anyway, enough defending my design choices. Right, so we've got this content, and then if we go further down, we've got this next header that is the content. So we're gonna again work with the semantics. We've got this concept of main, which is like the body of content or something like that. Or maybe we'll just use section for now. And in this section, I'm going to use a H2 for this. We're going to have the episodes title. And then inside this, we're going to have ourselves an iframe, which does this embed. And I've luckily got that code just over here. So if we take a look and see, we can now see we've got ourselves an embed of the entire playlist of this. It's a bit meta, I know, all the way back to day 24, which is the last stream. So, but we're not going to watch that right now. So let's keep on carrying on with our content here. So I've certainly not put all of the effort I need to into this spiel yet, and we'll get there eventually. But for now, we're just going to address this question, and then we're going to bring in the text. So inside, notice that there's this container here, this white that's placed around, so there probably need to be something to happen to get this all to come together, but we're not going to worry about that yet. As I said, we're just getting the content in, and then we're going to work on how to get it all to actually come together. All right, here's our text. So this is a paragraph, and all the paragraphs are exactly like that. And inside it, we've got some hrefs. So what kind of application are we making? Inside that, I'll put 2 paragraphs, and then we'll do a couple more of these. Fine. And then after that, we're going to do a footer. And it's just going to have a paragraph in it that says copyright. Oopsie daisy. Copyright 2018, James Rakic. Sweet. Okay. So now we have a skeleton that we can start to hang our CSS off of. And this is essential, because without it, we can't do much, right? We can't actually We can't write any code. There's no point. CSS does not exist without the HTML, which is why it's essential to put the HTML in place first. All right. So now that we've done this, we can start to look at our design and figure out the kind of things that we need to do to achieve this look. And we can start off very simply with the background color. Okay. And if you want a background color to cover the whole document, you apply it to your body. And that's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to find out what that color is because it's not quite black. Pull that off of there. And we'll open up our CSS. So wwa home.less. So we've got the body and we're going to give it a background of this color. So yes, let's talk in a little more detail about what this is altogether. And I'm gonna just make sure that my definition of all of this stuff sort of lines up. Oh, that is the wrong language. So let's talk about the basics of CSS, right? CSS is a declarative language, and what that means is that there's no real runtime logic taking place. And more recent specs start to bring in more interesting things. Sort of, it never really changes that property of it. But yeah, the declarative aspect of it is very important. There is no logic that takes place within CSS. In order for there to be logic, there needs to be something else flipping the bits, and usually that's like JavaScript that's making the changes, right? But CSS itself is largely a fixed thing that just makes your page look a certain way. And with your CSS declarations, you can see here we've got this explanation of what a CSS declaration is. You have a property, and then you have a value, and you've got a separator for it. And properties, there are lots of different properties. Some of them involve positioning, some of them involve color, some of them involve shadows, some of them involve how text is meant to render, or the particular font that is meant to be used. There is a whole range of different things which you can change on any particular thing. And you have blocks of declarations. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at a declaration block from curly brace to curly brace. And what you apply that declaration block onto is, and what are the words that are used here? So this is a rule set and this is a selector. So this here, this body tag, that is a selector. And we can expand that. We can have more than one selector. If we would say did this, then we have two selectors. So we have a body and a H1. And we're saying that any body in any H1 will have a background that is of this color. And so this body here corresponds to this body just here. But you don't only have the ability to select by body. You have other things that you can do selections by. If any of your HTML has a class, so say we had we put the class body class on this thing, instead of using the body tag, let me just do a reload. You can see that class body class there. So instead of doing that reload, what we could do is we could instead target .body class, and it would have the same effect. You can see that there. Still works, right? And if I was to prove the point a bit more, I'll just change that to white, and you can see that update there, right? So that's all well and good, right? You can tell certain aspects of the page to look like certain things, right? And let's go through and explore that without even worrying about classes or anything like that. So we're just gonna select against tags only. And we can get away with this because this is a relatively simple page. And so just to be clear, like a tag is just like a particular element type of HTML, just a tag, no classes or anything like that. So body is a tag, header is a tag, span is a tag, h1 is a tag, all of them are tags, right? So we've got the body and we're bringing it down to that background, and we may as well default to a particular text color. And that text color we will for now make white. Okay, great. Now, in addition to that, we may as well deal with the fact that we have a particular font here. Now, I've decided just for now to use Roboto, which is a font that is provided by Google Fonts. So we're going to go and grab that font and reference it in our CSS file. So you can see here Roboto. And what we'll do is we'll select that family, and we'll choose the weights that we need. So we don't actually use heavy at all, so we could probably get away with just using regular. But I think I'll grab bold and regular italic just so that I don't have to worry about it down the track, even though it does increase the amount of font loading. Okay. So now that we've done that, we need to embed it. And this gives some suggestions. You can put it in your top level style sheet, or you can do it with an import in the style sheet. We will do this in our HTML. We'll grab this font in our HTML. So I've just copied that standard import, and I'll put him up here. Put him before there, and bring it in. Very good. Okay. So now that we've got that, now we also need to reference that font family inside our CSS, and we will use a less feature here so that we just don't have to keep on repeating ourselves. Just call it default font family, and we'll grab Roboto, and then we'll have sans serif, and maybe eventually. So the idea here is you always have a font stack, and let's be a bit clearer on that. You always have a font stack, and the idea is if it has this font, it'll use this font, and if it doesn't have that font, it'll use this font. This is kind of less important these days because we have web fonts, but often what you would have is you would have a stack of alternatives, and then you would finally arrive at a particular, like at a system default, which is like either serif, sans serif, that kind of thing, or monospace. But typically, as I said, that stuff is not so important anymore, just because with web fonts, you can largely get the font that you actually want on the design. And what we want to do is we want to have that available. We want that to be the font family that is used throughout the page as well. So if we throw this in default font stack as well, you'll find that we should have everything being rendered in Roboto. If we inspect we should be able to find that as well. You can see that here. When I inspect, I've got this inheritance, and it says it's from font family body. Font family Roboto. Now you'll notice that a lot of the CSS, like it already has a sort of a hierarchy to it. So certain things are bigger, certain things are smaller. Like this is a H1, it's bigger than a H2. This is the same as a H2, so these are the two same size here. This is a H2, and then these are H3s, which are smaller. And this is essentially user agent styling. And what that means is the user agent, like whether it's Chrome, whether it's Firefox, most of them have some default ideas about what things are meant to look like. And you can see that exemplified here, where it says user agent style sheet. So these are the defaults that Chrome will apply to any H1. And if we jump into a H2, you can see the same thing going on, and you've got a font size of 1.5 EM there. Okay, so that's sort of our basics. And often that can actually be a bit of a pain because not all browsers necessarily agree on an ideal user agent style sheet. Some of them have like lots of little divergences. So one way that we can deal with that is a little library out there called Normalize CS. And you can see what it's promising here is like simply normalized CSS makes browsers render all elements more consistently and in line with modern standards. It precisely targets only the styles that you need more normalizing. Okay, so that's just to give us a little more consistency so we can work from a consistent baseline. So I'm going to use yarn to add normalized CSS. And I think, if I'm lucky, I should be able to actually just bring it right in. So I'll just use, so that went into node modules, and I should be able to bring in normalized CS, and yeah, we've got normalized CS just there. Very good. Okay, so by importing that into the file, now I don't know if anything will have changed. Let's look at our output CSS in our tools. Oh, no, didn't get it. Let's do that. There we go. Now we've got the normalized document in our place. Okay, so you would have noticed a few things changed, like a few margins disappeared and whatnot. This is less invasive than a full reset system, which actually just, it gets rid of everything, right? So we've got certain things that exist within the normalize, like you can see this font size and this margin and whatnot. So these are sort of little light touches that get everything to look the same of a particular size. So you can see here, correct the font size in Chrome, Firefox, Safari, blah, 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 blah. Like they've got all sorts of different ways in which they try to bring things back to a standard. And we're going to keep doing that. And we're going to be potentially a little more aggressive about just getting everything back to a particular way that we want. And we don't need to be too heavy-handed here. We just need to get certain things to be very particular. I don't like margins on things. I don't like padding on things that isn't necessary. So we're going to get rid of all of that margin that's not necessary. We're going to do the same for P tags and also ULs, LIs, and OLs. So respectively, P's paragraphs, UL is unordered list, OL is ordered list, and LI is list items. So list items go within ULs and OLs. Okay, so you can see here we got rid of all of that. So we're starting to get even further into a bunch of stuff, like just getting rid of all of the things that we don't necessarily need to help us do our job. Because really we want that stuff out of the way so that now we can write our own CSS that makes it look exactly the way we want to. And here we get to the point where we want to start thinking about how it is that everything's meant to come together. Actually, there's another thing we want to do here. We want to reset the font weight to normal, and we will want to put the font size to 1 rem. There we go. Okay. Peace at last. Everything is back to normal. Okay. So a brief note about sizing. So this 1 rem is based on the base size of the HTML item, which typically comes as 16px. And that is something that users can resize to a certain degree. But we're going to be using rem as our sort of baseline here. That said though, most of the time when people use zoom in and zoom out, that's a bit different than changing text size because everything changes along with it. Anyway, let me reset that. So yeah, 16px is fine as our sort of baseline size. We've got sizes that we like in here, and most of the time, yeah, it's 18px. So we're just going to have to do the math there to figure that one out. So if we do 18 divided by 16, 1.125. Okay. So we've got a header size that is 1.125 rem. That is for these guys, and these guys. This one here, same size, 18. So I'm just getting these noted so that we don't forget them. And then we've also got here, we've got this header, and that one there is 24. So 24 pixels. So let's figure out that one as well. So that's 24 divided by 16 is 1.5. I probably could have figured that out in my head, but it doesn't hurt. Right, FAQ header size is 1.5. Okay, so that gives us some sizes to work with, and now it's time to start to put things together. So let's start with a few basics here. You can see how these are not laid side by side. Oh, sorry, not currently laid side by side, but you can see there's a space here, and there's not like a new line here. Well, it's not too hard to do that. So if we were to say look at the header item and then choose the H1 inside of it. Now this is not best practice, but I'm trying to avoid talking about classes just to start off with, just so that we can focus on getting things to look a particular way, right? So let's look at the things that are synonymous with this. Actually, so inside the header, and this is not valid CSS, but it is valid less. So this allows us to work with all of the headers and the H2s within this one. So we just give them a command of display inline block. And that'll give us a chance to talk about this very first property of display. And we can have a play with that here. So display is essentially, it gives you some rules about how it looks, some standard rules about how it works with it. And there are a lot more than we want to really work with to start off with, such as things to do with table cells, and then different layout systems like flex and grid. But most of the time, to start off with, you're going to be working with like a couple of main concepts. Most sort of inline items have a display inline, and what that means is they, like, their rules won't think about things like margin and padding quite as much. It gets a little awkward if you try and do stuff like that. And it's really meant to be taken as something for text inline. So most things that would use that would be something like bold. In fact, let's make an example of that. We'll throw some bold on a text over here. And we'll throw an underline. You know, the funny thing is you're not actually meant to use bold tags anymore, so that's just bad advice. You should be using strong tags, or you should be using EM, which is short for emphasis. So here we go, two examples, right? So we've got the emphasis here, which is being displayed as italics. So here from Vitae Facilis Ex Maximus. And then here, the next Facilis Ex Maximus, you can see it's got Facilisis, and that is bold, based on strong, right? And if we were to inspect it, you can see that we've got this this strong, so it's got a font weight of, well, bolder here. And if we drop down a bit, in fact, we won't see it there, we'll probably have to find it in here. Here we go, we've got the display parameter, and it's inline. So this is inline content. And the big thing about inline content, or like anything with display inline, is that it can break. And you see that there? It can break. And that is a very important thing to understand, because if we look at these items up here with their display inline block, you'll notice that they don't break in portions, the whole thing breaks. And it's only inside itself that it can break. And that's a very important thing, because with inline block, it means you can sort of keep chunks together, and also makes it easier to lay them out. Now, I do tell a slight lie. Inline you can do margins with. So say for this item here, this strong item, say we wanted to put a margin left on it, it would work, right? And if we margin lefted it all the way across, it would break at this point. And then it gets a little weird, but it still works, right? But yeah, the tools don't like it very much when I do that sort of stuff. Now, I'm pretty sure margin top would behave a bit differently. And we will talk more about how margins work and whatnot, but yeah, you can see there when I try to use margin top, it just doesn't do it, all right? An inline item must be inline, so the whole point is you can't push it down, you can't push it up. It's meant to sit on the text baseline, and you're just really either pushing it left, pushing it right, and doing certain things with it. But you've got a lot less layout opportunities with regards to that kind of thing. So yes, display inline is one option. Display inline block is yet another one. So inline block is, as I said, like it creates a smaller block that is technically in line, but gives you a little more room to play with. So you can do things like you can give it a margin top, and it will try to figure out what to do with it, right? And typically what that means is all these elements, say side by side, you can see them sort of, you can see those margins in there, and then you've got this other item here, this span, and it's just sort of sitting there chilling in the same region as these, and you can see how these margins, so that's the highlighted orange section, how it's pushing it down there. So inline block gives you a little more room to do stuff like that, and it also, as I said before, it makes sure that it breaks. So you can see here, once there's not enough room for this slogan here, this tagline, the moment there's not enough room, it goes to the next line rather than breaking internally first. Important concept. Okay. Now, the final option that we'll talk about for now is display block, and most headers will already be that. Well, all headers will already be display block, and so will paragraphs. And you can see, if we look at the inline style here, yeah, you can see the display, the current computed style is display block. And essentially what that means is there's only one of it on that line, and things that follow on after it, like anything that follows on after, even if it's an inline item, it will have to be on the next line. So it consumes all of the space. And you can see that if we inspect it, you can see that it's currently consuming all of the space. If we were to change that to inline block, you could see that it is no longer consuming all that space, but because the next paragraph is a display block, it consumes all the space on its line, so it's fine. Okay. So with that in mind, let's think about this header and try to be a bit more explicit. So this header is a display block. It lives on that whole space. And if we look at it, it's sort of like, it's just off to the left here. And that's fine. And you can see that there's a bit of space here. And let's, so that's 57 pixels of space there. So I'm just gonna use pixel values just for the sake of brevity. So underneath it, we're gonna make a margin of 50 pixels. And that's because there was just a bit of space in it that I sort of wanted to disregard. Okay, so I'm just going to try and give us some space here, and then we're gonna make our header sort of set start to behave itself. So spans by default are inline items, and you can see a bit of weirdness if we look at that there, because you can see the SVG is actually bigger than the span, and we don't necessarily want that. So let's put display inline block on the span as well. So I guess it can join the club here. All right. So now the span is properly containing the SVG, and then we have H1, H2. Great. All right. So we're starting to slowly work our way towards something that looks a bit more like this. Now we need the space. So you can see 17 pixels around it. So let's give it that padding. So here's where we start to put things together in various ways and get into essentially the box model of CSS. And this is very important. Did I just close the thing? Yes, I did. I got a bit carried away there. Let's... I have good key bindings, right? They get things done really quick. So if I throw in some padding, you'll see that we've got some space around our humble little box here. Great. Okay. And yeah, let's talk box model. Time to bring out the pens. Now the interesting thing about this box model is it changed, and there was like a disagreement from one side of the fence to the other. One side of the fence being called Internet Explorer and the other side of the fence being everything else. This is one of those cases where a lot of people believe that Internet Explorer got it right and everyone else got it wrong, and eventually we were given the means to make everything work the same way. But here's the deal. Let's talk about the box model in its barest concept and then go from there. And I'm going to try and use the same colors that our handy little thing here. So blue is the body aspect of your box, right? And inside the body is where the text goes, right? So if you put something inside of it and that stuff is positioned in a certain way, then, and we'll get more into that, then that is sort of your body space. And then outside of that, and what color are we using for outside of that? We've got green, yellow, and then orange. Okay, yep. So now we've got, outside of that, we've got our padding. So the padding is essentially meant to be white space that goes inside of your box. So if this is of a certain height and you say that there's 10 pixels padding, then there should be here 10 pixels of space between the edge of the box and the actual content. So in this small spot, and I'm going to use red in this particular case, we have our border. And for purposes of demonstration, let's just throw a border on some of these items here. So if we give it a border, we'll make it 1 pixel solid and red. And you can see we have our border there. So that's a border, right? And that does take up space. So a border is different, adds a little bit more space. So if that is 1 pixel, then that space needs to be taken up somewhere. And then around all of that is your margins. I've got the smoothing on. Got to turn that off. There we go. All right. So I might just get rid of all that and then draw it again just to, yeah, much better. Okay. So now you've got your margin on the outside. And the big difference with margins is that with margins collapse. So if you were to say have 2 boxes that look exactly like this side by side, well, what would end up happening is, if we have, I'll just do the border for this one, and then we have the margins. You can see here, so you can see there, those margins, they have collapsed, which means if this had, say, 30 pixels margin on its side, and this one had 30 pixels margin on this side, then with them both equivalent, you would not end up with 60 pixels of space between them, but rather they would collapse together, right? Now, if those values were different, say we had some item over here. This is normally how we do layout, but anyway, let's just use it to labor the point. And say it had 20 pixels of margin only on its left side. My drawing is terrible. All right, so if there's 20 pixels here, however, if it was 40 pixels here, then the margin collapsing would mean that this would get swallowed up in that extra space, right? And you would just use that margin of 40 to put the space between them. So if you can get all this working together correctly, then it's actually quite nice, this whole feature of margin collapsing, because it means that you can be quite certain that an item, if you say that it's going to have 100 pixels above it, then it doesn't really matter if something above it has a small bottom margin, because that'll just get swallowed up and the spacing will work out all right. Now the concept of, this sort of box model is really important when we start to lay things out. And there's a couple of key interactions that we need to be aware of. So you can see, if we go to CSS basic box model, we can see a lot of text that talks about this sort of thing. But what I really want to get into is how that works with the concept of width. And here's a very so this is the main thing that changed when we started to get a bit better of an idea of how CSS works, because there was a point where if you used a particular type of content box, so here you've got this child here, and if you did width 100%, it would include the border and it would include the padding. But most of the time, people thought that was kind of weird, right? And if you said 100%, what you really meant was that 100% would be not the width of the bit in the middle, so not the blue bit. You would think that if you wanted something to be of 100% width, let me write this down. So if you wanted something to be 100% width, you probably really meant from this end to this end. So that was the way Internet Explorer did it, and all of the other like compliant browsers did it. That's an oversimplification again, but I don't really want to get into history. But really, the model, this content box model, was more like, hey, this is what 100% means. So this would get expanded out to fill that gap, and you can sort of see that discrepancy right here. This whole content box. Because generally we think about 100% in this way, it makes a lot of sense for you to pretty much change everything to be border box instead. It's just the nature of the beast, and that's because because of that, and you go to CSS Tricks or wherever, and people will go, hey, this is probably the better way to go, hey? And yes, you can get the whole sorted history of how the box model worked, which was a bit weird. So these days, we do something like this. And that means that everything sort of follows the rules, and when you say 100% width, you end up with what you really want, which is for anything that is of a particular width. Let me think the best way to say this. Whenever you say 100% to something, it's going to fill like the space of its child 100%. It's going to look like this example here rather than this example here, because here we're telling it to be 100%, but you can see it's growing out of the parent container. That doesn't feel like 100% width, right? And a lot of unexpected things can happen. Now, technically, that 100% would be accurate if we were to change this padding to 0 and to change this border to 0. Suddenly, 100% is accurate. Okay, so border box is about getting that expected accuracy back. Anyway, despite that slight digression, if you don't fully get the box model, I highly recommend you have a play around with how it looks in terms of like understanding the history of the box model here, looking at the basics for CSS box model in the MDN documentation. The key things to understand for now is that margins collapse, and if you use these particular rules, if you use border box sizing, that'll make your widths and whatnot predictable, so that you can then play around with your padding, your concept of padding, the actual content inside, and then the borders, okay? Now, let's have a look back at our actual working example. So we've got this padding around this space here. So, and then we've got these items here moving along. So we've got the span in the middle, and then we've got these H1s, H2s. And you can see they're not quite in line because of padding and whatnot. They're just not quite in line. Is there a potential way we can do this? Now, this doesn't always work, but it sometimes works, so we may as well give it a shot. So what you can do with inline blocks is you can set their vertical alignment. And I'm going to do just that and see how it looks. It's close. It's not quite perfect, but it's close. And vertical align is one of those things that essentially only applies to inline blocks. or inline items or inline blocks. It allows you to do things like say, all right, I want the baseline to be in line, or I want them to all be in line at the top or at the bottom. There's a whole bunch of different properties that we can use. Baseline is the text baseline, just to be clear, which is why it's lining up with the base of this one here. Whereas bottom means pushing it all the way down to the bottom of the thing that's containing it, right? But if we set to middle, we can sometimes get the kind of centering we want, which we've kind of got there, which is good. Next off, we had ourselves a little bit of separation here. And we could potentially achieve that with a margin. So we've got 18 pixels between that and that. So let's do that. We'll give it a margin right of 18 pixels. And you might be wondering, what about that little slash character, right? Well, with that slash character, is that content or is that presentation? And one would argue that it's presentation. So if we can, it would be nice to avoid using the CSS to avoid putting it in the document, okay? So, I mean, potentially less enlightened soul might go, all right, let's make a span, give it a class of separator, and put a slash on it, right? Which, I mean, technically works, but that's a separation of content and style. And to a degree, separation of content and style, you can't escape it forever. You will eventually have to put some information about how things look in your HTML. But if you can avoid it, it's kind of preferable, right? So what we're going to do instead is we're going to use, instead of using this margin here, what we're instead going to do is going to use a pseudo property, which allows us to inject content in. So this pseudo property allows us to put that slash in. And now we've got ourselves a little thing that we can actually do things with. We could say, give that the margin left of 18px, give it the margin right of 18px, and we are good to go. All right, that was handy. Now, it still feels a little down, but I'm not going to play with that too much. I'm going to carry on and just play with a few more things in our page, right? So next up, we've got this past episodes block, and we've got the block that hangs up the top here, and then we've got the iframe that sits in the middle. And then you've got this margin left and right that's sort of common to this section and to this section. So rather than so there are a couple of different ways you can do this, because we need to think about what's going to happen when the page gets really big. Like, is it going to be that this stays centered, or is it going to... Oh, I made a mistake. Is it going to stay centered, or it'll always stay centered, but is it going to be a case where this space, this 103 pixels, but we'll probably make that a round number, is this 103 pixels going to stay the same at all times, or is it going to hit a certain point and then stay in the middle? And for the moment, we'll just say it's the same all the time and sort of observe this particular part of the box model. So we want this to center in that particular way. And the way we're going to do that is if we look at this main, and now, so we've got these two sections and we can't actually differentiate between them. So we are going to need users, just a little bit of classes. So I'm going to give it a name of past episodes. So this, to be clear on what Pug is doing here, this gives, this is the same. This past episodes is sort of the same as using class.fact. So if I did .faq, that would be the same, right? So here, now that we've got this class, we can select against it in some way, shape, or form, and we're going to do that down here. I'll just oopsie daisy. Yeah, that's all right. Okay, so we've got past episodes, and we want to position this in the center. So let's do just that. We'll give it a margin left of 100 pixels and a margin right of 100 pixels. Because this item is a block item, and because by default that means it needs to fill the whole space, well, you can see here you can see here that it's merely put that margin on left and right, and then filled the remaining space with what it has available. And you can see here, if we scroll in, so the margin left, the margin right stay the same, and the width automatically takes up the rest. And like, if we wanted to be really explicit about what the width is doing here, we could say do width auto, and that would match our expectations here. If we were to do something else, like say set the width, you can now see that the width is sort of filled out, and it's actually disobeyed our margin now, because it realizes that it doesn't actually, like, the margin plus margin left plus margin right plus width does not actually fill the space. So it ends up filling up the remainder of that space with a margin because it is a display block. If we were to make it display inline block, you can see that it actually obeys that directive now. So it's got margin left 100, margin right 100, and then the width is automatically set. Anyway, let's get rid of those and get us back to just this idea that we've got margin left and margin right set. Good show. Okay, so we've got this iframe and it's got a width set on it, and we want to sort of change that, really. So what we're going to do is, instead, we're going to give that iframe a width of 100%. And this might end up in a weird deformation. Yep, definitely, weird deformation. So you can see that the iframe, you've got that width, and then the height, well, that's not quite right, yeah? And like, if I did height auto, that wouldn't be right either. I want it to maintain an aspect ratio, and this is where we sort of introduce a particular approach to this sort of thing, because simple fact is you got to maintain aspect ratios in all sorts of various ways. And we've, like, in the past, like, my business partner and I have found that we just like to use a particular hack an awful lot to deal with this particular problem. And we're just going to give it a class of ratio frame. I don't know, we'll start to introduce an idea. Of some sort of naming. This is a weird naming, and I'll explain it eventually. This is for a class, and what we're going to do is we're going to hit that class called past episodes frame wrapper and do something that makes it possible for us to be really explicit about how big a thing is meant to be. And in fact, we'll just pull the iframe out of it for now and demonstrate this this concept with the frame wrapper. Oh, I did a mistake. There we go. Okay, so this thing is invisible right now. This frame wrapper. Can't see it. Why can't you see it? Well, it's because it's zero height, zero width. Oh, zero height, but 100% width because it's of display block, because by default divs display block. All right, so it's invisible right now, and we could give it a height with a height, say 50 pixels. We could even go 100%, and it wouldn't know what to do with itself because the thing above it has an automatic height. So height 100% don't work in that case. But we do want to base its height off of something. We want some sort of fixed height, right? Well, it turns out padding is always, if you do a padding with a percentage, it's always based on the width. So if I do, if I get rid of the height and I say do padding bottom, and I make it 100%, or let's say 50%, well, you can see that that padding is actually exactly half of the width. And it turns out this is super useful. Like, this is one of the most ridiculously useful aspects of CSS, and it's not going to change anytime soon, right? You would break countless sites if they did that. There's literally no reason for them to change this implementation at this point. The fact that padding percentage is based on width means that you can create a relationship between width and height. So we've got this 960 and 540. So 960 divided by 540 is 1.7777. Okay, we actually want to go the other way. We want to go 540 divided by 960. So the height of this is 56.25% of the width. And what does that mean? Well, that means that if we did 56.25%, and we've got a thing that is taking up space, which is exactly the right size for our iframe. And then, in addition to that, we can then force that iframe to sit in a particular space. And this gives us, hang on, let me put that padding on the frame wrapper. It was meant to be 56, wasn't it? Not typing so well right now. All right, 56.25. So now we've got that spacing. Still no good, right? We've got this iframe sitting here, but we want to force it into a particular position. And that brings us to the next big concept that we need to address, which is the concept of position. So if we grab this iframe and we look at the position rule, we've got static, sticky, relative, fixed, absolute, all sorts of things. Now, most things by default are static. What they mean by static is that they exist within the flow of the document and they'll just occur one after the other. So these are all static. Now, the next thing that you'll probably use often is called relative. Relative items are still static, but then you can do little things to nudge them various places. So if I did a top 10 pixels, I've nudged it 10 pixels from where it was without moving anything else around it. We could also nudge it to the left. We could nudge it off to the left, and you can see there, it's just moved off to the left. And we could keep on going. We could use the negative properties and push it all the way off the page if we really, really wanted to. Not that we do. So relative is one particular way that you can move things around, but it still exists within the document flow. And to make this point a bit more strongly, let's put it over here. So if we did a position relative on this H3 here, and then we also used, say, the top property, and we started to lift it up, so 10 pixels, okay? And I'm gonna keep going. Let's bring it all the way up here. So it's 280 pixels higher. That's like negative pixels with top, it's gonna go higher. It's 280 pixels out of position from its base position, or where it started, its static position, right? But you can see that the space is still there for it. All right, we can't select it there, I don't think, if we inspect element, but we definitely know that that's where it would be in a normal static position, and we'll certainly see that if we turn off position relative, it snaps right back there. Yeah. Okay, so you've got position static and position relative, and both of those exist within the document flow. The next big thing is position absolute. And position absolute gets used a lot to move things around in a very particular way. So if we were to use position absolute here, to start off with, it sort of just freaks out, doesn't know what to do. But then we can start to give it particular instructions. Like if we do top 0, you can see here it locked up to the top. And left 0, it locked to the left. Interesting. What's happening here? So when you use position absolute, what you're saying is that I want to be really specific about where it is in relation to my next offset parent. I might be getting the terminology wrong, but essentially there will be some element above this one which governs sort of position absolute positioning. And if you don't set anything into, like, if you don't set anything to position relative or with translation or anything like that, then that something is going to be the top, like the absolute outermost element of the page. That's your sort of your parent, your offsetting parent, and that means that when I did position absolute on the iframe, it went to the top and then to the left, and then it was done, right? And if we say did something like we want to have it height 100% and then width 100%, well, by golly, you've just filled the page with this iframe based on your offset parent, which is this body. Okay, this is good, but what we actually want to do is make it fill this frame wrapper. But we can do that quite easily by adding position relative. Oh man, not typing so well today. So if we add position relative to it, you can see here that now it's being contained within frame wrapper. So now all of those properties that that we were kind of desirable, that top 0, that left 0, and then the height 100% and width 100%, all of that combined with position relative to set the offset parent means that this will exist within this quite nicely, and this frame wrapper maintains the aspect ratio. So now, no matter what, we have got this perfectly desirable aspect ratio that fits the video fits the video player just fine. Kind of what we want, right? So let's throw that code in. And this is one of the benefits of prototyping here, is this is like usable code, right? Like I can, if I can get my selection to work right, I should be able to just chuck that in there. Oops. And I've just got to put position relative here. And we're good to go. We've got ourselves a nice aspect ratio obeying piece of content. Very good. And like this is a common thing because you got to do it with images, all sorts of things to make sure that those images aren't constantly snapping while the images are loading. You want to like reserve space for it, and this padding bottom trick is a really handy way of doing that. Anyway, I'm going to move this up. And bring in this ampersand. So this is the way I would normally do this kind of code. And that way there's only, like if we have a look at the actual code that's generated here, you can see here, we've got past episodes, and then we've got past episodes frame wrapper. And then here we've got past episodes space iframe. And we'll clean that up later, because I'll talk a bit more about naming in CSS once we get a bit further along. All right, now this isn't actually quite right yet. You can see here we've got this little what's the word here? We've got this little border here. How big is that border? 8 pixels. Well, I've actually made it a bit uneven because I'm a bit lazy. But anyway, let's make it 8 pixels. 8 pixels on the nose. Right. Now we don't want to put it on the... actually we can put it on the frame wrapper because of the... Actually, I don't believe we can put it on the frame wrapper, because if we do... So if we do border 10px solid, and then we do red just to make it really conspicuous. Oh no, that's all right. So position absolute respects the border. It keeps things within the border. So we're actually all good to use that. So we'll make that 8 pixels on the nose, and then I'll just find out what that color is. Bring that in. If I was using more colors, I'd make variables for these things, but this is fine as it is. Okay, so you can see that there. And now we just need to position this past episodes header a bit more nicely. So that one there is a H2. And I mean, we can probably make an assumption that a margin left of about 8 pixels is about right. And it doesn't look quite hard up, so we'll add that space as well. That looks like a 7 to me. We'll make it 6 pixels. Now, these are all wrong size at the moment, I believe. They're all 16 pixels, and we need them to be a bit bigger than that. So let's deal with that. So this H1 and H2. Meant to have a font size of header font size. I'm at an hour, but what I'm going to do is charge on through, because I think I've covered most of the major things that I need to cover, and I think it's important that I just keep on rolling through this. I'm going to change the font size up to the top so that hopefully... no, they didn't do it. Yeah, because we've got this guy here. Yeah, unfortunately, even though we've got this, yeah, because of the nature of the baseline here, these are actually sunk a little bit. when I do vertical align middle. So I'm going to have to do some compensation for that. I'm not a huge fan of what I'm about to do, but I'm going to do it just to nudge it up just a wee bit. So I just used a bit of a negative margin. Negative margins aren't great. They aren't super maintainable, and there are ways that we can sort of get around having to rely on them for various things. But I'm just going to do a little bit of pixel pushing just to get us moving forward on this one. So yeah, -4 pixels seems to do it. So that's good. Okay, so next up, we've got ourselves this what's this all about section. So let's handle that. We'll just give ourselves a little bit of room around the past episode section. So let's give it a margin bottom of 100 pixels. And now we've got this FAQ section. And there's some unfortunate layout things that we've got going on here, because we've got a section and then we've got a header and then we've got content within it. Now, how does this work? Can this work? Because at the moment, it looks like we would need to have the it looks like we would need to have something around this in order to render it properly. Yeah, we'd have to have some sort of box. We'd have to have this header, and then we have a box around this content. Sort of like what we have here, where we have a wrapper around here and then here. But, I mean, technically, we don't need it. We don't actually need it if we're happy with the spacing being based on the distance between this and the next box. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So say if we're going to give it the same margin right and the same margin left. That brings stuff inside here. And in fact, what I might do, like typically I don't worry too much about side-by-side editing. The reason for that is because I can usually visualize what it is that I'm doing as I'm doing it. So it's kind of handy. But in this case, I want you to see what's changing as I work through it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to give it a background of white. Good show. All right, we can't see anything. Okay, let's give it a color of black. So color determines the color of the font. Probably could have said that earlier to you, but it completely went over my head. Didn't realize what I was doing. Anyway, so that color, that works. That's good. But what's next? Well, this first header, this H2, well, that's the first child. Maybe we could do something special for it, hey? How about we go, because position absolute can be used to push things into all sorts of positions, right? So say we did a position relative on the FAQ. Note that that doesn't actually change anything. It just means that it's now an offset parent. Now what we could do is maybe absolutely position the child, right? So let's give it absolute position. And all right, you can see things have already gone a bit weird because it's like everything's gone into like they're just ignoring the position of it now. But what we want to do potentially now is we want to get it up on top of things. And what we could do is do a bottom 100%, and that would mean that it would be positioned. We've got to make it white in color as well. So that bottom 100% means from the bottom of this section here, I want you to like position it 100% from the bottom. So 100% means it spans all this distance, and then the bottom line of it is right here, which is pretty useful, right? So, and I might just, oh hell, I'll do the experimentation here. So if I give it a background of red, just to make it a bit clearer where it is, and then I make it a bottom 50%, you can see that is now 50% of the way from the bottom of this object, okay? Or if I went 100%, it's now 100% back where I put it. Or if I went 150%, now it'll shoot off somewhere up this way. Great, okay? We want 100% though. And then what we can do in addition to that is do a little bit of a nudge using margin. So if we did say the same margin as the H2 up here, now we've almost got it in the right position. We just need to change the font size a little bit on it. So let's use that font size, header font size. So we'll use that here, and I'll use it down on this this H2 as well. I'm not necessarily writing the most efficient CSS here, like there is repetition in there and whatnot that I could be making less CSS out of, but I'm just sort of pulling things together just so that you can start to understand CSS itself more than anything. All right, so now we've got this section. We've lifted that H2 up using position absolute. It's pulled it out of the flow, and now we're looking at all of the things that are inside of it. So let's start with just this little bit of padding, and this is a little inconsistent how I've sort of positioned things. I put it in there a bit hastily, but let's give it a padding of 8 pixels, which based on the rem is 0.5 rem. That could also work because relative EM, like that's relative to sort of the base size, which is 16 pixels. All right, this is good, but this is not quite right because it seems like this is a little far over. Yeah, because it's not positioned into the all the way to the left. So if we positioned it all the way to the left, or we remove the margin left, then that would be fine. That's an interesting thing about absolute position, is even though it's not statically laid out, it does have some memory. So if, and this is actually a really interesting part, right? If you had a particular thing and you absolutely positioned it, if you don't set, say, the left property on it, it'll just assume wherever it would have been statically in terms of where it positions itself, which means you can see here where we've got this, like if I don't explicitly set left, it will go, oh, well, I was meant to be here, so I'm just going to go up to here. But whereas if I explicitly set left, that's going to push it into that corner. And then apply the margin from that point, and then it works out. Anyway, carrying on, let's work our way through these little bits and pieces here. So we have some p tags, some paragraph tags, and for each of them, we want this font size. Okay, and then we also want some sort of general margin that we want underneath each of them, and you can see the spacing here. So that 20 pixel margin. And there are a couple of ways that you could do this. You could go margin bottom 20 pixels. This has a slight issue, which we'll find out real soon. Now, we've got these H3s. These H3s are actually bigger. So let's do that one here. And I'm deliberately keeping this blind because I want you to see what results out of this sort of this logical stepping. All right, so that is FAQ header size, FAQ header size. And even though they're technically exactly the same, we'll use body font size there. All right, so we've got font size, header font size here. And then I just want to see what this margin is. So this is 33 pixels, so we'll just use that. So these headers always got 33 pixel margin, right? All right, let's see what we ended up with. Oh, whoops. Header size. There we go. Okay. So now we've got this together, and it's all kind of alright, except for down here at the bottom, you've got this margin bottom on this padding, margin bottom on this p tag. Then it collides with the padding. There's no collapsing that happens between padding and margin, so this sort of makes sense, right? And then you've got the sections padding, and then off you go. But what if you didn't want that to happen, that final one there? Well, maybe a better way to think of this is, well, every time we've got two p tags, one after the other, we know what that margin is meant to look like. So maybe that would make more sense to work with. So we could do something like, instead of margin bottom on the p, maybe it's p plus p. Plus is an interesting property, right? It's like when there's a p after a p, what do you want to set for the properties of the p afterwards? It's not the best explanation, but it'll, I guess, do for now. So here, what this means is, and this will sort of look more like what we want, because you can see we don't have that p tag here, but you can see all of these gaps here are starting to work out. And the reason why they're working out is because whenever there's a p after a p, it gets this rule applied to it. So this paragraph after a paragraph, p plus p, will mean that, okay, that's got a margin top, but not this one at the bottom here. Well, let's see, this one at the bottom here also has a margin top, but it's never about the bottom margins now. It's only ever about what's between these two. So the plus selector is actually extremely useful. There's a lot of times where you want, okay, when this thing is bordered by this thing, I want them to behave in a certain way. Now, some other things that might be interesting, right? So if we were to say, all right, honestly, this is just to show the concept of margin collapsing more than anything. So if we have margin bottom on p tags, now this mostly works out. Aside from this bottom part right here. So you can see here, these both have, so these items here both have these margins. You can see they overlap, right? So you can see how they've collapsed together to be one margin. And you can see here how this p tag's bottom margin does not affect the fact that this hrefreeze margin is set to a specific value, and it just accepts that largest value. So that's good. Margin collapsing helps us out there. All right, so that gives us some content. This is all very well and good. And now we could just finish this off just for today by centering this footer. And technically, we don't even need any padding or margins or anything like that, because it just gets centered into the middle. So maybe let's do just that. Let's give it a margin top of, say, 30 pixels. Maybe a bit too much. And let's give it a margin at bottom, so it's never hard up against the bottom of the page like it currently is. And we'll give it 100 pixels. So now, if you scroll down, you can see all that space, right? Now, as terms of font size, I don't know what I set it to, but it's probably something small. It's 12 pixels, right? So 12 pixels is 1/4 of 16. So the footer font size would be 0.75 rem. That's good. And we also want to align this text in the middle. This is another rule we haven't used just yet, but as good a time as any to introduce it. Text align center is quite simple. You just set the text alignment. And I'm just going to drop over here and talk about different types of text alignment real quick. So most things are text aligned left by default. And then from there, you've got other text align options. Let's have a look at them all. So there's a few different ones. Don't typically use start or end, although I believe start and end have to do with your locale settings, because there are some languages that do read right to left. From here though, the main ones we'll probably be using are left, right, which you can see here brings over to the right. And then after that as well is justifier. Justifier is one of those things that isn't always the greatest, because the way it spreads out text, it's not particularly good for legibility. You create these rivers of text and whatnot. But justify is what you want to have happen if you want the text to expand out to completely fill the space. Anyway, that is our text alignment. So yeah, with this one footed with a centered with the footer font size, although I don't think it's actually, yeah, because the p tag's got the font set on it, what we actually want to do is we want to change this to be on the p tag of the footer. Alright. Good stuff. Alright. Now, this is CSS. It's not particularly maintainable CSS, and we'll get into that more down the track. But for now, this will serve as a good introduction, and we will explore more how we make our CSS more maintainable, how we make it so that the kind of CSS that we're writing is more predictable in terms of how it behaves. And this will become very important once we start to actually build a web application in our CSS. So I think we'll call it at this point. So I'm just gonna put this together. If I've got everything. Okay, so we are on day 25. Intro to CSS using Weekend's web app promotion page. Good show. All right, that'll do. So next time, what we're going to do is we're going to take these concepts and improve our understanding of how we can do the best job we can with our CSS in terms of making it maintainable down the track. Because like we just put a bunch of stuff down and like the CSS works, but it is not maintainable CSS. It's the kind of CSS it we'll find is quite brittle when we start to push it over in various ways when we start working with it tomorrow. Right, so anyway, that's the code up and running. We will do our next stream tomorrow at around 8 p.m. That's pretty much it from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.